Hi everyone, welcome to Lecture 4 on Hippocratic medical theory. Last week we started looking at the Hippocratics and looked at how they conceive themselves as medical professionals and what they think the art or expertise of medicine is, what its methodology is, and that sort of thing. Today we're going to look at some of the foundational principles of their underlying medical theory itself and how they thought about the nature of health and disease. For the Hippocratics, there were six main factors in health and disease. The first was the four humors, which we're going to talk about at the greatest length today. The second was the nature of our internal organs, tissues, and various parts of the body. Third, the seasons of the year. Fourth, our natural environment around us. Fifth, our diet. And sixth, exercise and activity. So the first two of these we can think of as the internal factors in health and disease. These are the things that are internal in the sense that they're the things that are actually going on with our body and its parts. The second set here, items 3 and 4, can be thought of as the external things. They're the things going on in the world around us, outside of our bodies, that can affect our health and disease. And the fifth and sixth items here can be thought of as behavioral. The name that the Hippocratics often use for these two combined is regimen. Regimen for them consists in both how what our diet is, what we eat, but also what kinds of activities and exercise and fitness activities we engage in. Another way of conceiving the relationship among these six items is that the first two here are the primary causes of disease and health. So whenever we're healthy or whenever there's illness, it's always immediately going to be due to something going on with these two factors within our bodies. The rest of them, 3 through 6, the external and behavioral, are secondary causes of health and disease. They're secondary because they can influence what goes on internally. So that things like the season of the year, diet and exercise, as we'll talk about today and into next week, are all things that can influence what's going on with our four humors and with our internal organs and bodily parts. So these things influence health and disease, but they do so secondarily by having effects on the primary causes of health and disease, which are the humors and our bodily organs and tissues. Okay, so let's start by talking about the four humors. This is one of the sort of aspects of Hippocratic medicine that they are most famous for. It's one of the things that had a really enduring impact on Western thinking about medicine and psychology. It's also just a really kind of fun topic. So let's jump right into it. Okay, so according to the humoral theory of the Hippocratics, human beings are composed of four different types of humors that each has its own special properties, qualities, and also functional role to play within our bodies. And those four humors were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And each of these is defined in terms of two main properties that it has with respect to two pairs of opposites, hot and cold on the one hand, and moist and dry on the other. So they thought of blood as being warm and moist, yellow bile as being warm or hot and dry, phlegm as being cold and moist, and black bile as being cold and dry. Okay, so let's look now a little more closely at each of these and sort of what they do in our bodies on their view. The main function of blood is that it is the source of nutrition and growth for us. So when we eat food and take in nourishment, that ultimately gets broken down and sent to the blood, and then the blood carries the nourishment to the rest of our body. So the fact that we are able to, from the time we're little, grow into adults, the fact that our bodies, once we're adults, are able to continue to be sustained and nourished, that's because the blood is providing that nourishment throughout our bodies. Because blood has the property of heat or hotness, it also contains the vital heat that sustains life. So we saw in some previous weeks that Greeks were very aware of the fact that living things, human beings certainly, have a certain warmth or body temperature, and when we die, our bodies go cold. So it takes a certain amount of heat to keep us alive, and the warmth that's in blood is what delivers that heat throughout our bodies. Phlegm is the humor that is especially prominent in mucus and saliva. And its main role is to purify the organism and eliminate waste and impurity. So if you think about when we cough up phlegm or when we sneeze, phlegm and mucus and saliva come out. And what's going on is that that's our body's way of getting rid of impurities within it. So that's the main role of phlegm. It also helps to keep the body cool and moist. So remember that the Greeks were very interested in balance. And if we only had hot elements in our bodies, we wouldn't be able to survive because we would become too hot. We need also a cool element to make sure that it's properly balanced with the hot and that it keeps our temperatures sort of in the right space. So we don't want to be too hot or too cold. And phlegm is the thing, because of its moistness and wetness, that sort of cools us off and makes sure that we don't become too hot like we do, for example, when we get fevers. The general main function of yellow bile is to produce rarefaction. That is, it makes things thinner and more dilute. It also breaks things up, which is, of course, a way of making them dilute. So, for example, it's the humor that is responsible for our digestion. It breaks up the food that in our stomachs. It also prevents constipation by thinning our stool. It also thins the blood. So if the blood were too thick, it wouldn't be able to flow naturally and smoothly throughout our bodies. So it makes sure that the blood has the right level of thinness that it can move rapidly throughout our bodies. It's also responsible for fighting off irritants in the body. So, for example, when we get a cut or have an inflammation, like when our skin gets inflamed, that's the response to an irritant, and that's yellow bile doing its work of fighting off an irritant. When we vomit, that's yellow bile, and that's where, when we think of vomit as having like a yellowish color, that's where they're getting the yellowness of yellow bile, is that it makes us vomit up things that are irritating or bad for our bodies. And the same thing with diarrhea. That's a way of fighting off irritants in the body. Black bile does just the opposite of what yellow bile does. Namely, it produces solidification. It makes things more tightly packed and dense. In some parts of our body, it makes things extremely dense, in particular in our bones and teeth. So our bones and teeth have a lot of black bile that makes them very, very sort of compact and durable. It's also responsible for solidifying stool so that we don't always have diarrhea. And it's responsible for coagulation of the blood in wounds. So when we get cut, if we didn't have enough black bile, there were only yellow bile, we would just continue to bleed. But black bile, because it makes things solidify, is responsible for the fact that when we get a cut, the blood can coagulate and the wound can close and gradually heal. Now, something to note about the nature of the four humors is that they're not all just completely in isolation from one another. In fact, it's really bad when they're totally isolated from one another. Rather, all of our various sort of parts and fluids and things within our bodies have different mixtures and different proportions of the four humors. So even something like blood, which is one of the four humors, even blood is not pure blood or just 100% blood. Blood also contains small amounts of both black bile and yellow bile. It contains some yellow bile so that it can stay thin and move throughout the body smoothly. And it contains some black bile so that it can coagulate when we have a wound. Now, health occurs for the Hippocratics when the four humors are mixed together in all the right proportions, in all the right places. So everything is sort of where it's supposed to be, mixed together in the right quantities for the various purposes that our organs and tissues and fluids in our bodies are supposed to serve. Note, however, and this is very important, that having the right proportions does not mean that each of the four humors has an equal amount in our body. So if our bodies had equal amounts of black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, we wouldn't be able to survive. Rather, our bodies have by far the most blood in them, more than any of the other humors. And then this shows you, sort of relatively speaking, how much of the others we're supposed to have. I just kind of made up these proportions. This isn't like an exact ratio, but it's just to show, relatively speaking, blood is the most, and then black bile is what we have the least of. So we're healthy when those things are all mixed together in the right proportions, in the right places. And pain and disease occur either when one of the humor is excessive or deficient, so there's too much of it in a certain place or not enough of it, or it's separated away from the others. So again, the humors need to be well blended, well mixed together. And so if we have, for example, some yellow bile that sort of separates off from a mixture that it's supposed to be well blended into, that will cause pain and disease. And when this kind of separation, as the Hippocratics refer to it, occurs, what's going on can cause pain and disease both in the area that loses that humor and in the one that gains it. So for example, if we have some yellow bile that's supposed to be well blended with the other humors in an area around our liver, and it moves to the area around our kidney, that separated off yellow bile can cause problems both in the liver that has now lost some of it and in the kidney that it's now gained more separated yellow bile than it should have. The four humors are also correlated with the four natural elements: earth, water, air, and fire. So we saw that the natural element, and these four in particular, played an especially important role in earlier Greek thinking and in the systems of the early Greek philosophers, some of whom are contemporaneous with the Hippocratics. So yeah, here's how they correspond to the elements. Blood corresponds to air. Air is thought of as being warm and moist. Think especially of humid air. That's what the Greeks have in mind. Fire is hot and dry. Water is cold and moist. And earth is cold and dry. So the four humors have qualities that are sort of likened to or similar to these four natural elements. And they're also correlated with a variety of other tetrads or sets of four. So for example, they correspond to different tastes. They also have certain organs that each one is associated with. So the heart most obviously is associated with blood. The brain and lungs are associated with phlegm. So, think of coughing up phlegm. And then the gallbladder and spleen also have special roles to play or have special associations. Okay, so the four humors also play this really interesting role in explaining the nature of human psychology and human personality traits for the Greeks. For the Hippocratics. So the exact mixture of the humors varies from person to person and can affect our personalities. So it's true that human beings, in order to be healthy, have to have, just the right balance and just the right proportions of the humors in our bodies working and doing different things in different places in these appropriate proportions and mixtures. But Within those proper proportions, there's a little bit of wiggle room where certain elements will have a little bit more. Some people will have a little bit more of certain elements than others. And that element that they have a little bit extra of affects who they are and what their personality is. And so what's known as the theory of four temperaments is based on which humor is the dominant humor in your body. Which one do you have a little bit more of than the average human being? And there are four main personality types for the Hippocratics: sanguine, choleric, phlegmatic, and melancholic. And this is one thing that, again, they had a lasting impact on Western medical and psychological thought for a long time. This is one thing that you can see traces of sort of throughout Western history and Western literature. So the humoral theory of personality, for example, plays a large role in Shakespeare. Shakespeare also often uses the language of these terms and their associations that ultimately have their origin in the Hippocratics. Okay, so a sanguine personality is somebody who is dominated by blood, choleric person by yellow bile, phlegmatic person by a phlegmatic person by phlegm, of course, and then a melancholic person by black bile. The word melancholic comes from the Greek malaina chole, which literally just means black bile. So for this week's assignment, I had you take this sort of Greek personality, this Hippocratic personality test. And I went through and I've shown like what the results are for each of the four personality types. I'm not going to read through these. I think it would be a useful exercise for you to read through those in more detail on your own on the slides. But I just want to kind of talk through a little bit what each of these four personality types is and how it's sort of explained by or supposed to be related to the specific humor that is inside of them, and also the element associated with that humor. So, for example, people who are sanguine are supposed to be very sort of kind, social, warm-hearted, energetic, and that is something that is associated both with blood and with the element of air. So air is something that is constantly on the move. It's constantly in motion. Air is constantly traveling around, and it's going lots of places. So that explains sort of like the socialness of a sanguine personality. Also, sanguine people are dominated by blood, which is associated with the heart, and by the warmth of blood. And so, we have the term warm-hearted. That means someone who is very kind and loving toward others. And that is associated with that warm-heartedness and with blood. Choleric personality types tend to be competitive, more aggressive, ambitious, passionate, sometimes rash. And you can see how that relates to the qualities of yellow bile on the one hand, and also the element associated with it, fire. So recall that one of the functions of yellow bile is to fight. Its job is to fight off irritants in the body. And so choleric people, similarly, tend to be more combative, more argumentative, maybe more prone to anger, more prone to these sort of like fighting instincts. They also tend to be more rash people, not necessarily think through all their decisions to move quickly. And similarly, like fire is a really like fast moving, like fire never stays still. It's always in motion, and it can spread really, really quickly and in like a dangerous way. So choleric people are passionate, competitive, and aggressive, and that corresponds to the qualities of the humor and the element that's associated with them. Phlegmatic people tend to be relaxed, calm, kind of steady, sometimes even a little bit lazy, but also because they're like sort of calm, they tend to be rational. Now, how does this relate to the element they're associated with, which is water, and the humor, phlegm? Well, if you think about water, we have the phrase that relaxed people go with the flow. That sort of like invokes the kind of notion of water that they have in mind. Also, water, when you compare it to air and fire, is a relatively slower moving or steadier or calmer element. So, yes, sometimes water can move. For example, the sea can become stormy, but really when that happens, that's because of things like wind, or often because of wind and storm. But water can also just be, a placid lake. If you place water in a glass, it's not going to move around, it's just going to remain still. So phlegmatic people tend to be chill because of that. And chill, actually, just now occurred to me, is another good sort of way of thinking of how they relate to the coldness of the element that dominates them. And then finally, we have melancholic. So melancholic people tend to be more prone to sadness and depression, and also to sort of like thinking deeply, to thinking heavy thoughts. And you can see how this corresponds both to sort of black bile itself and earth. So for one thing, blackness itself has connotations in a lot of cultures with sadness or mourning. This was also true for the Greeks. So for example, black is like, in many cultures, the color of mourning, the color that people wear to funerals. Also think about how, when we are feeling depressed, we think of ourselves as feeling down. Down, the earth is sort of the most down element. It's the element that falls down through all of the others. It's heavier than water, heavier than air. And so earth is sort of at the bottom, and it's very sort of stable, and it's also very deep. The earth is very deep, and melancholic people tend to be the sort of deepest people. Okay, so here are these. So for what it's worth, this is what this was my score on the quiz. So I'm especially melancholic and choleric, and not very much these things at all. Also, for what it's worth, the Hippocratics considered the sanguine personality type to be the best personality type. Like, they're social and kind, and like everybody loves them. They're great. And the worst personality type is melancholic. So that's me. Okay, so that's the four humors. Those are the main. That's one of the main things to understand about Hippocratic medical theory. Next, let's look at the nature of our organs, tissues, and bodily parts. So each different organ within us has its own sort of distinct material composition, its own shape, texture, density. The elements or humors that compose it are in different proportions to one another, different levels of hollowness or sponginess, and their different qualities, their different physical qualities, make different organs suited, certain kinds of organs and tissues better or worse suited to certain kinds of functions in our body, and also better or worse suited to absorb some of the humors. So some organs, for example, are considered spongy organs. The bladder is considered a spongy organ, and so that makes it especially well suited to soak up or absorb fluid in our bodies, which is then what causes or why it's like the organ of urination. Another example is the womb. The womb is a spongy organ that is suited to absorbing the humor of blood. We'll talk more about wombs when we get to Hippocratic gynecology, because they have a lot of very weird stuff to say about wombs. But at any rate, that gives you an idea that like one of the things that affects our health and disease is just these different organs that are all supposed to have their own distinct kinds of composition. And when we're healthy, their composition is sort of in the right proportions in each case. Okay, so those are the internal factors. Let's now look at the two external factors. And then next week, when we look at Hippocratic sort of treatment, how they treated patients, then we'll focus on regimen. So moving on to the seasons of the year. The seasons are one of the things that can affect the four humors in the body. And that's because each humor corresponds to a season of the year. So spring corresponds to the blood. Spring is a warm, wet season. April showers bring May flowers is the expression. Summer corresponds to yellow bile. It's hot and dry. Fall corresponds to black bile. It's cold and dry. And then winter corresponds to phlegm, which is cold and wet. And so each humor is the most plentiful during its corresponding season, and it's the least plentiful during its opposite season. So for example, blood will tend to be most plentiful in our bodies during spring and least plentiful during fall. By contrast, black bile will tend to be most prominent during fall and will tend to have the least of it during spring. So again, there's like these slight variations in our humors from person to person that affects personality, and also the time of the year and the season, this external factor in our environment can affect like this by a little bit, which humor tends to dominate in each season. And then the prevalence of a humor in its corresponding season affects which kinds of diseases are common in a given season. So for example, in summer, when black bile is the most prominent, we're more prone to dysentery. In spring, when blood is the most prominent, we're more prone to nosebleeds. In winter, when phlegm is the most prominent, we're more prone to coughs and colds. And you can see how they would sort of get at some of these associations, especially in the case of like winter colds. Okay, and then moving on to the second of the external factors in health and disease, our environment. So for the Hippocratics, environmental factors, which for them primarily meant the local land, the water, and most importantly of all, the air or winds in that area, have significant effects on the body and its constitution and on sort of the distribution of the humors within each person. So just as seasons of the year can affect us for short periods of time throughout the year, when we live in places that have certain kinds of climate and certain kinds of environmental fixed environmental features, those can have more lasting impact on the people who live there. So one of the things that Hippocratic doctors had to understand in order to be able to treat patients effectively was these environmental factors, how things like soil quality, where people were getting their water, what the air quality was like, where winds were coming from, whether it was the north or the south, cold or warm winds, for example. They had to understand all of these things and take them into account in their treatment practices for patients. And one reason why this was something they needed to do and that was on their mind was that a lot of doctors in the Greek world were itinerant. That is, they would sort of travel around from town to town throughout the Greek world, treating patients as they go. And so because they were on the move and traveling to different kinds of places with different kinds of distinct or idiosyncratic environmental features, when they got to a new town, one of the things they would need to do is, okay, where are they getting their water? What is the wind like? What is the air quality like? They would need to consider all of those things because those things they thought could be affecting the nature of patients and would need to inform their diagnosis and also their treatment plan for the patients. So in this one of their treatises that we read an excerpt from, Airs, Waters, Places, the author is doing just that. They're giving some general principles for how to go about understanding the soil, water, and air of different kinds of climates. And so, just to give like one example of types of water that are better or worse, the author talks about how rain is an especially healthy and salubrious form of water. It's the lightest, sweetest, finest, and clearest type of water. So, although they didn't exactly have our notion of evaporation, they did understand or believe that the sun or heat draws water up out of, say, the ocean. And that's why the water in the ocean is very unhealthy for us, because it has all sorts of sediment and salt and brine in it that is unhealthy. But when it's drawn up into the clouds and then falls down as rain, all of the unhealthy bits, the saltiness and the sediment and the earthy things that are in the seawater, those get left behind. It's sort of purified through the process of being drawn up by the sun. And so then when it rains down, that water that we get is sort of the healthiest form of water. Snow and ice, they present some arguments for thinking that it's less healthy for us. And then they also talk about things like rivers, lakes, marshes, and other kinds of water. So this is just one example of how they thought environment could affect us. Okay, so that's all for today. Next week, we're going to start looking at how Hippocratic doctors actually treated their patients and what sorts of treatment recommendations they made. I'll see you then.